Camille Turner had only wanted peace. After 10 relentless days embedded in a high-stakes federal operation, she looked like any other weary traveler. Sweatshirt, sneakers, hair tied back. To most, she was invisible. But to one gate agent at Hartsfield-Jackson, she was something worse. Suspicious. That morning, at gate B32, the simple act of boarding a flight became a battleground. A white woman in uniform made a snap judgment. A passport was torn in two. And in that split-second decision, she didn't just insult a passenger, she committed a felony. The real shock? The woman she'd tried to humiliate was no ordinary traveler. Camille Turner was one of the highest-ranking federal aviation inspectors in the country, and the gears of justice were already turning. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The events that followed were not just about one agent's arrogance. They revealed a system rotting quietly beneath polished airline counters and corporate mission statements. What began as a single act of racial profiling exploded into a full-blown federal scandal that exposed negligence, discrimination, and criminal endangerment. It was a firestorm set off by one small, petty act, and the sound that lit the match was the soft tear of a United States passport. The morning air was thick with humidity and impatience. At the world's busiest airport, the terminal pulsed with movement. Strollers squeaked, luggage wheels clacked, boarding announcements echoed overhead. People rushed past each other with earbuds in, coffee cups in hand, eyes glued to departure screens. But at gate B32, time froze. Camille, 48, stood at the boarding counter with a calm that came from decades of crisis training. She had flown in and out of this airport more times than she could count, on missions, audits, inspections. But today she was just trying to get home. Dressed in her favorite Howard University sweatshirt and gray joggers, she looked like a tired mom or a professor off duty. And maybe that was the problem. Maybe that's all Brenda Kowalski, the gate agent, saw, a black woman flying alone in first class who didn't fit the picture in her head. Brenda didn't ask questions. She didn't scan the passport or verify it through the proper channels. She made a face, said something sarcastic, and ripped it. Just like that. Torn in half like it was junk mail. It was the sound of entitlement, of unchecked authority, of 1,000 paper cuts finally slashing deep. And everyone in that line heard it. Some gasped. Others stood still, unsure what they'd just witnessed. But Camille didn't blink. That small tear may have destroyed a document, but it awakened something else entirely. Gone was the traveler. In her place stood a federal officer. Her voice was steady, her words precise. Brenda thought she had embarrassed someone. Instead, she'd triggered an investigation that would unravel careers, ground flights, and bring a billion-dollar company to its knees. In less than 5 minutes, the airport's rhythm was replaced with tension. Phones started recording. A crowd gathered. Brenda crossed her arms, smirking like she had won something. But that confidence began to falter when Camille spoke, calmly citing federal statutes, legal consequences, and codes no civilian should know. And then came the call. One button on Camille's phone. One name, Director Evans. "I'm invoking Code Black at Gate B32, she said. And just like that, the ground began to shake, metaphorically at first, then physically, as law enforcement swept in, cordoning off the scene. What Brenda didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that she had just made the worst mistake of her professional life in full view of 100 strangers. And among those strangers was a young woman with a camera phone, and a future social media post that would rocket this story into the national spotlight before the plane even finished boarding. The drama had only begun. And by the time it was over, there would be firings, lawsuits, indictments, and congressional hearings. But at that moment, at the instant the passport split in two, none of that had happened yet. All that existed was silence, a stillness in the air, heavy and waiting, and Camille Turner standing tall, eyes like flint, ready to turn that stillness into a storm. Camille Turner didn't look like someone who held the authority to ground an entire fleet of planes. That, she had long realized, was both her greatest weapon and her greatest burden. At 48, Doctor. Turner had spent over 2 decades in the crucible of federal aviation security. Her resume read like a classified dossier. Former aerospace engineer, Ph.D. from MIT, decorated field investigator, senior inspector for the FAA's Office of National Security and Incident Response. She had authored federal protocols, helped redesign airport response systems after 9/11, and led covert audits that had quietly shuttered multiple underperforming regional hubs. And yet, on that morning in Atlanta, none of that mattered. Because to the woman behind the gate counter, Camille was just a black woman in sneakers and sweats, flying first class with no right to be there. But before she was Doctor Turner, before the badge, the clearance level, or the government-issued secure phone, she was just Camille. Raised by a single mother in Richmond, Virginia, the daughter of a postal worker and a librarian, she had grown up watching planes slice across the sky from the cracked porch of a modest house on Chamberlain Avenue. While other kids played with dolls or chased fireflies, Camille took apart old radios and begged her science teacher for broken lab equipment. Her mother called her Fix-It Girl, and by age 11, she could disassemble and rewire a ceiling fan faster than most grown men. Her obsession with flight wasn't romantic, it was mathematical. She loved the symmetry of wings, the language of pressure and thrust. It wasn't about escape, it was about control. In a world that so often tried to define her, Camille found comfort in physics. It didn't care what she looked like. It only cared that she got the numbers right. She earned her doctorate in aeronautical engineering by the age of 26. By 30, she was the youngest systems lead on a military drone calibration project. She could hold her own in rooms full of men twice her age, most of whom didn't believe she belonged there until she opened her mouth. And when she did, their doubts died quick deaths. But despite her rank, her accolades, and her clearance level, Camille Turner never forgot what it meant to be underestimated, especially by those with just enough power to be dangerous. That was what made her so effective in her current role. Unlike her male counterparts who walked into airports flashing badges and barking questions, Camille worked in silence. Her strength lay in observation, in blending in, slipping past the surface of things, and uncovering rot where others only saw routine. She called it quiet power, and it was exactly what she brought to Operation Safe Skies. The mission had been her idea, an unannounced undercover audit of America's busiest airport terminals to test everything from document verification to personnel bias under pressure. It wasn't about catching terrorists, it was about catching complacency. Camille knew the real threat wasn't just a bomb in a bag, it was a lazy inspection, a biased assumption, a corner quietly cut and never questioned. For 10 days, she lived out of a hotel near Miami International, wearing different disguises each morning. Some days, she was a frazzled mom. Other days, a no-nonsense corporate executive. She even posed as a nervous international student once, her posture shy, her accent softened. Each role was crafted to provoke a different type of reaction from airport staff, and she documented it all, timing interactions, noting inconsistencies, and flagging security lapses. It was grueling work. No glory, no headlines. Just long days, late nights, and reams of typed notes stored in a locked compartment in her room. Her body ached from the constant motion, her mind from the constant calculation. But it was the kind of mission she believed in, because Camille Turner knew this country could do better, and she had spent her life proving it. That's why, on the day she returned home, just 2 hours from the finish line, she allowed herself a small indulgence, a first-class seat on Flight 782 to Washington, D.C. It wasn't luxury, it was recovery. After a week of emotional whiplash and strategic disguise, she just wanted legroom, quiet, and a glass of ginger ale. She dressed down intentionally, gray joggers, a navy blue Howard sweatshirt, the fabric soft from years of wear. She tied her hair back into a tight bun, tucked a paperback in her bag, and arrived early, moving through the terminal with the fluid grace of someone who had made this journey 1,000 times. In her backpack, alongside her laptop and notes, was her well-used U.S. passport. 5 years old, slightly worn at the edges, but undeniably hers. She carried herself the way only experienced travelers do, with purpose, with poise, with the kind of internal map that needs no signage. But the moment she arrived at Gate B32, she saw the red flags. The gate agent, Brenda Kowalski, radiated the kind of performative professionalism Camille had seen before. Polished on the outside, poisonous underneath. Camille watched her fawn over a white family, calling the kids sweetheart, offering reassurances about seating. Then, moments later, she snapped at an older South Asian man with a curt, "It'll board when it boards." Camille didn't need a badge to know what she was looking at. She had trained her own agents to spot it. Authority bias, racial microaggressions, gatekeeping disguised as procedure. Still, she said nothing. She didn't reveal who she was. She simply approached the counter when her group was called, placed her digital boarding pass under the scanner, and handed over her passport. And that was when everything shifted. Brenda's eyes flicked to Camille's sweatshirt, her sneakers, her skin. Then to the passport. The smirk came next. Then the questions. Then the mockery. "This doesn't look like you," she said, her tone slick with suggestion. "A doctorate in what? Art history?" Camille answered calmly. "Aeronautical engineering." She didn't flinch. Not when Brenda laughed. Not when she accused her of buying a fake. Not even when she held the passport up and, without warning, tore it clean in two. That sound, it echoed louder than the terminal announcements, louder than the rolling suitcases and murmured conversations. It was a sound Camille would never forget. Not because of the paper, but because of what it meant. It meant that even now, even after all she had done, a woman like Brenda could still look at a black woman in sweats and decide she didn't belong. It meant the protocols she had written could be ignored by someone with a keyboard and a bad attitude. It meant the system was more fragile than it looked, and that maybe, just maybe, she had been right to be afraid of that all along. But fear had never stopped Camille Turner. It didn't stop her that day either. When she picked up the phone and called Director Evans, she wasn't just reporting an incident. She was sounding an alarm. She knew what was coming. Federal agents, airport police, subpoenas, audits, firings. She wasn't just reacting. She was triggering a reckoning. And not just for Brenda. For the entire airline, for every unchecked act of cruelty hidden behind company policy. For every complaint buried. Every safety inspection skipped. Every gate agent who thought a uniform gave them the right to play God. Dr. Camille Turner had given them all the benefit of the doubt, for years. Now she was done. She wasn't angry, not outwardly. She didn't shout or cry. She didn't need to. The truth was enough. The law was enough. Her reputation, quiet, methodical, unshakable, was enough. She stood at gate B32 not as a woman wronged, but as a system rebooting itself in real time. She had become the exact force she'd always hoped her country would be for her, fair, firm, and unwilling to look away. And as the crowds watched, phones recording, breath held, Camille knew the moment had arrived. Not the moment she proved herself. She had done that long ago. This was the moment she made sure no one like Brenda would ever get away with it again. Brenda Kowalski had been working at Ascendair for 22 years, and she never let anyone forget it. She started as a baggage handler at the small Tulsa Regional Airport and clawed her way up to gate supervisor in Atlanta, a position she treated more like a throne than a job. She wore her seniority like armor and her power like a weapon. In her mind, she was the last line of defense between chaos and order, between those who belonged and those who didn't. At 46, Brenda was one of those people who aged into their attitude. Her voice was always a few decibels louder than necessary, her expressions sharp, her tone clipped. Her once bright blonde hair was now kept in a rigid helmet of spray and curls, unmoving even in the humid Georgia air. She wore her uniform with military precision, name tag always straight, nails always done, and her smile only appearing when a white family with well-dressed children approached the counter. Her co-workers knew her type. Hell, some even feared her. Brenda didn't yell. She didn't need to. She mastered the art of the professional slight. The long pause before helping a passenger with an accent. The sigh when someone asked a stupid question. The miraculously lost boarding pass that always seemed to belong to someone who didn't speak English fluently or didn't look like her. She'd raised gatekeeping to an art form, and for 2 decades no one had dared call her on it. She wasn't stupid, not in the traditional sense. She knew how to follow procedure when it suited her. She knew how to sweet-talk supervisors, how to shift blame down or sideways, and how to write just the right number of words in an incident report to keep it vague and untraceable. Complaints came in, sure. But Brenda had Frank Miller, her station supervisor, in her pocket. Frank was a company man, more interested in on-time departures than personnel drama. As long as Brenda's gate got planes boarded and in the air, he let her do things her way. And her way worked for her. Until the morning of gate B32. Brenda noticed Camille Turner the moment she walked up. Not because Camille was disruptive. She wasn't. She was quiet, polite, but she stood out in the way black women often do in predominantly white spaces, especially when they're calm, composed, and not playing small. That confidence set something off in Brenda. There was no hello, no warmth, no curiosity, just suspicion. Brenda clocked the Howard University sweatshirt, the sneakers, the natural hair pulled into a tight bun. First class? No way, she thought. Something didn't add up. She made a snap judgment, and like so many times before, she acted on it. Not because she had to, but because she could. When Camille handed her the passport, Brenda didn't run it under the scanner. She didn't use the UV light embedded in her desk. She didn't even verify the barcode. Instead, she held it up to the light like she was in some spy thriller. She scrutinized the photo. She smirked. "This picture doesn't look much like you," she said, loud enough for others to hear. Camille's voice was calm, even. She explained it was her primary form of ID, valid, issued by the Department of State. But Brenda wasn't interested in facts. She was interested in winning, in establishing control. "You look younger here," she said with a sneer, "happier." Then the final twist of the knife. Doctor of what? Philosophy? Art history? It was the kind of remark she had made hundreds of times, just subtle enough to fly under the radar, but sharp enough to sting. She expected Camille to flinch, to get defensive. She didn't. Instead, Camille's tone shifted. "My doctorate is in aeronautical engineering," she said, voice cool and firm. "Is there a problem with the document, or may I board the plane?" That was the moment Brenda felt it. Control slipping. This wasn't the usual passenger. She wasn't scared. She wasn't begging. She was standing her ground, and Brenda hated it. She leaned in closer. "There's a problem with me believing this is a legitimate document," she said, turning her voice into a stage whisper, just loud enough for the passengers in line to hear. A few turned their heads. That was the attention Brenda wanted. She was playing to the crowd. "First class? A brand new passport? Doesn't add up," she said. It wasn't new. Camille explained that clearly, but Brenda wasn't listening. She was performing. "Maybe you bought it," she added, almost gleefully. "People like you can be very resourceful. I've seen it all. Fake IDs, fake credit cards, fake everything." And then she did it. Without warning, she tore the passport in half. Not out of fear, not out of protocol, but out of malice and power. For a second, there was silence, the kind of stunned, almost reverent hush that comes after something terrible happens in public. People froze, mouths fell open. A woman gasped. Brenda stood there, chest puffed out, passport halves fluttering to the counter like dead leaves. She felt proud, victorious. She thought she had exposed a fraud. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined, was that she had just committed a felony in full view of 50 witnesses. She had torn up a federal document belonging to a senior FAA official on assignment, and Camille Turner wasn't going to let it slide. Even as Camille calmly recited the U.S. Code, even as she called her director and requested a full law enforcement response, Brenda stood there, arms crossed, smirking. She didn't believe it, couldn't believe it. "You're nobody," she whispered, almost to herself. But when the agents arrived, federal and airport police both, her bravado began to crack. Her smile faltered. Her face turned pale. That morning, smugness curdled into visible fear. She tried to recover, claimed the passport looked fake, claimed she was protecting the flight, claimed discretion. But the procedures she ignored, the protocol she tossed aside, it all came back like a boomerang. When the investigators pulled up her history, the damage was already done. 14 complaints over 5 years. 9 from passengers of color. 4 from passengers with disabilities. 1 from a retired veteran with prosthetic legs whom Brenda told, "You're holding up the line." Each file had the same note from Frank Miller. Counseled employee. Verbal warnings. Case closed. But this time, there would be no quiet closing of the case. The complaints were no longer personnel issues. They were evidence. As Camille calmly delivered her statement to the agents, Brenda sat slumped in a plastic chair in a windowless interview room. The authority she had once worn like a crown had been stripped away. Her voice, once sharp and commanding, was now a broken whisper. She admitted, under questioning, that she hadn't used the document scanner, that she hadn't verified the passport, that she went on a feeling. A feeling. That's what all her decisions had come down to over the years. A feeling about how someone looked, spoke, walked, dressed. Her personal biases had become her standard operating procedure, and nobody had stopped her, until now, when Agent Chen laid it all out in cold procedural language: failure to follow protocol, willful destruction of federal property, racial profiling. Brenda had nothing left to say. She asked for a lawyer. She cried. She tried to find someone to blame, but there was no one left. Frank had turned on her. The passengers had witnessed everything. The video had already gone viral. In less than 10 minutes, Brenda had gone from gatekeeper to defendant. The very authority she had abused had become her undoing. Her fall wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was slow, bureaucratic, methodical, like watching a tower collapse one floor at a time. And it all started with a tear. Not a metaphorical one, a literal one. The sound of a passport being ripped in two. The sound of her career ending. The sound of justice beginning. At Gate B32, inside the bustling heart of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, the noise was constant. Boarding announcements, the hum of luggage wheels, the metallic clink of coffee stirrers, and the occasional impatient sigh. But in the precise moment Brenda Kowalski tore the U.S. passport in half, that clamor fell away like a curtain. Silence descended, shocking and immediate. It was the kind of silence that follows something sacred being desecrated. And for a brief, breathless moment, the whole airport held still. The two halves of Dr. Camille Turner's passport fluttered to the counter, landing softly with a slap too final for something so small. The royal blue cover, split cleanly down the middle, lay open, the golden eagle now torn at the wings, its authority shredded as carelessly as junk mail. Brenda stood there with the smug satisfaction of someone who believed she had just defended the homeland. In her mind, she'd just stopped a fraudster, maybe even a criminal. Certainly not someone who belonged in first class. What she had actually done was commit a federal crime in front of 50 eyewitnesses, several rolling cameras, and the very person whose job it was to enforce that law. Camille didn't move right away. She stood perfectly still, looking down at the ruined document with the quiet intensity of someone burying a loved one. The humiliation was fresh. The heat of public insult burned in her chest. But she didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't plead for reason. Because Dr. Camille Turner didn't need to. She was reason. She was law. She was everything this moment had underestimated. Brenda, oblivious to the tidal wave she'd just summoned, stood with arms folded, lips pursed in triumph. The silence of the crowd only inflated her ego. She mistook it for admiration. She thought she'd won. She had no idea the storm had just arrived, and that she was standing at ground zero. Then Camille spoke. Not loudly, not angrily. Her voice was calm, precise, and carried the weight of authority like a bell tolling in a cathedral. "You have just destroyed a United States federal document," she said, voice low but unnervingly clear. "That is a federal offense, Title 18, Section 1543 of the U.S. Code, mutilation or alteration of a passport, punishable by up to 25 years in prison." The crowd, which had been frozen in stunned silence, began to shift. Some gasped, a few pulled out their phones. One young woman near the back, who had already begun filming, lowered her camera slightly, her eyes wide. Brenda's smugness faltered. Her lips curled down into uncertainty. This wasn't the reaction she had expected. "It was a fake," she said, louder than necessary, as if trying to convince herself more than anyone else. "I was protecting the integrity of the flight." Camille didn't even blink. "You had procedures. You had equipment. You had a chain of command. Instead, you made a choice, a personal one, an illegal one." The line behind Camille had grown longer, but no one moved. People weren't boarding, they weren't complaining, they were watching, transfixed. Camille took a slow step back from the counter, creating space not just physically but emotionally. She reached into her backpack, not hurriedly, not aggressively, but with the same deliberate calm she used in cockpit inspections and security briefings. Brenda flinched. She was expecting a badge, maybe worse. But Camille pulled out her phone. She tapped a contact marked Director Evans. The call connected on the first ring. "Evans, this is Turner," she said, her voice clipped and efficient. "I'm invoking a code black at Gate B32, Hartsfield-Jackson. We have an active security breach, willful destruction of federal property, and a violation of civil rights by an Ascend Air Gate agent. I need TSA and the FBI Airport Liaison Team on site immediately. Get legal on the line. Ascend Air is about to be in breach of their operating certificate." The crowd reacted in waves. The businessmen who had been murmuring now stood silent, brows furrowed. The family with the toddlers stepped back, huddled closer together. The woman with the camera phone raised it again, this time holding it at eye level. Brenda's confidence melted into panic. Her face turned from pink to pale as the magnitude of what was unfolding began to settle in. "You're lying," she whispered almost inaudibly. Camille ended the call. Her tone changed slightly, no longer just professional, but assertive, commanding. "My name," she said, "is Dr. Camille Turner. I am the Senior Field Inspector for the Federal Aviation Administration's Office of National Security and Incident Response. I've spent the last 10 days conducting a covert audit of airport compliance procedures under Operation Safe Skies." She stepped forward again, her gaze like steel. "And what you've just done," she continued, "will be Exhibit A in a federal investigation into Ascend Air's Atlanta operations." Brenda looked like she might collapse. Her knees wobbled, her lips trembled. The proud posture she'd worn minutes ago now sagged under the weight of disbelief. Just then, a man in a tight blazer arrived at the gate, breathless. His name tag read, "Frank Miller, Station Supervisor." He didn't greet Camille. He turned straight to Brenda. "What the hell is going on?" he barked. "We have a flight to board." Brenda's voice cracked. "She tried to board with a fake passport," she said, pointing at Camille like a child caught in a lie. Frank turned to Camille, trying to smooth things over. "Ma'am, I'm sure we can clear this up." "Your time to clear this up has passed," Camille said, eyes cold. "Your employee committed a felony. This gate is now under federal investigation. Flight 782 will not be departing." As if summoned by her words, 2 uniformed airport police officers appeared at the jet bridge entrance. Behind them, 2 plainclothes agents approached with the quiet, focused intensity of professionals who didn't ask questions. They answered them. Agent Chen spoke first. "Dr. Turner?" Camille nodded. "Yes. The subject is Brenda Kowalski. The evidence," she pointed to the torn passport, "is right there. I need it bagged. I also want gate camera footage pulled immediately, and Ascend Air's employee conduct records for the last 48 hours. Frank Miller sputtered, "You can't just... This is my gate." Agent Chen turned to him, eyes like ice. "Sir, when a federal crime is committed on airport property, this becomes our jurisdiction. Step aside." Frank looked ready to protest again, but stopped. The air had changed. This wasn't his playground anymore. The plainclothes agents moved quickly. Agent Davies donned nitrile gloves and carefully placed the 2 pieces of the passport into an evidence bag. The silence was heavy, the watching crowd now transformed from idle passengers into silent witnesses to a live investigation. Camille stood tall, completely composed. She had faced down congressmen, generals, CEOs. Brenda Kowalski was nothing compared to the real threats she had faced. But Camille also knew this moment mattered, because Brenda was the threat. Not just to her, to the system, to the integrity of every protocol that passengers relied on to fly safely and fairly. "Let me tell you what you've done, Brenda," Camille said, her voice now carrying throughout the gate. "You didn't just destroy my passport. You exposed a rot, a culture of unchecked power, and now, finally, that rot is going to face sunlight. Brenda couldn't speak. Her mouth moved, but no words came out. When the airport police gently took her by the arm, she didn't resist. Her eyes were glassy. She looked not like a villain, but a person finally forced to see the cost of her choices. The confrontation ended not with shouting, not with sirens, but with the solemn efficiency of justice being set in motion. Camille didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply watched, her expression unreadable, as Brenda was escorted away. She wasn't interested in revenge. She was interested in change. And at Gate B32, that change had officially begun. In every great reckoning, there comes a moment when the tide turns, not with a roar, but with a hush. That moment arrived at Gate B32 just after the passport was torn, and the air had thickened with the weight of a collective realization. The passengers didn't know exactly what had just happened, but they knew it was something big, something wrong, something that couldn't be unseen. For Dr. Camille Turner, the transformation was quiet, but absolute. She had entered the terminal as a weary traveler, blending in, head down, hoping for anonymity after a grueling 10-day assignment. But in an instant, her identity had been challenged, her credentials destroyed, and her dignity publicly questioned by someone who saw only her race, her sweatshirt, and her seat class. That moment was meant to reduce her. Instead, it released her. The mask of patience she had worn, the disguise of ordinariness she'd cultivated for days, vanished. In its place stood the true Camille Turner, senior FAA field inspector, national security expert, a woman trained not just to respond to chaos, but to command it. The federal agents had arrived. Brenda Kowalski was no longer posturing. She was backpedaling, eyes darting between Camille and the growing crowd of onlookers. Frank Miller, the station supervisor, stood there with the look of a man realizing he'd bet everything on the wrong horse. The roles were reversing, and fast. But what made this the true turning point wasn't the badges, or the handcuffs, or the legal threats. It was Camille's voice. Measured, controlled. Yet each word landed like a hammer. "You didn't just insult me," she said, addressing Brenda and Frank, but loud enough for everyone within earshot. "You compromised the integrity of a federal security operation. You've turned a routine boarding procedure into a criminal act, and you did it because of how I look." The tension in the air snapped taut. People shifted uncomfortably. Some passengers, still clutching boarding passes, slowly stepped away from the counter, as if proximity might make them complicit. A young woman, maybe in her 20s, who had been recording from the economy line, took a step closer. Her phone was angled down now, not hidden but unobtrusive, still filming, still capturing. Brenda tried one last gasp of authority. "I used my discretion." "You substituted your discretion," Camille snapped, "for federally mandated procedures. You ignored your training. You bypassed the UV verification system installed in your own desk. You chose not to call a supervisor. Instead, you decided you were judge, jury, and executioner." She turned to the agents. "I want her training logs pulled. I want to know when she last passed the PIV certification, passenger identification and verification. I'll bet she's overdue," Brenda stammered. I just had a feeling. Her attitude. She didn't seem what?" Camille's voice was suddenly sharp, like cold steel. "Didn't seem submissive enough? Didn't look like she belonged in first class?" That was when it hit everyone. And this wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't overreaction. This was the moment the spotlight hit the rot. Frank tried to save himself. "Look, we all have hard jobs. Brenda was just trying to—" "No," Camille said, turning on him. She wasn't trying to protect the flight. She was trying to protect her sense of power, and you allowed it. I've read the complaint files. 14 in the last 5 years. 9 from passengers of color. 4 from those with disabilities. You signed off on every single one with a verbal warning. You enabled this. You own this. Frank's face went slack, drained of color. He looked down, realizing that every small issue he'd brushed aside had just snowballed into a legal and reputational catastrophe. But Camille wasn't finished. Today isn't about one passenger and one gate agent. It's about a system that tolerates small acts of prejudice until they become large-scale liabilities. Well, that ends now. The federal agents nodded. They had begun taking statements. The officers had established a perimeter. Passengers were asked to clear the gate area. The flight was grounded, officially. Flight 782 was no longer a departure. It was a crime scene. As Camille gave her initial deposition to Agent Chen, the young woman with the phone quietly approached. "I got everything," she said softly. "I didn't mean to film at first, but once she started yelling, I knew it wasn't right." Camille nodded. "Thank you. That footage will be evidence." The woman looked shaken. "I can't believe she tore it up like that. A passport. I mean, who even does that?" Someone who thinks they're untouchable, Camille thought. But she only said, someone who's about to find out just how wrong they were. Brenda, now seated and trembling, watched all of this unfold like it was a bad dream. Her confidence was gone. Her hands were clasped in her lap, white-knuckled. She looked at Frank for support, but he had already stepped away, carefully aligning himself with the investigators, hoping to salvage what little of his career remained. The power dynamics had flipped completely. Camille turned to Agent Davies. "Get me employee logs for the past 48 hours. I want to know who else worked this gate. If this is systemic, and I believe it is, we're pulling the whole thread." Agent Davies nodded. Already on it. Across the terminal, the buzz was building. Word had spread. People were whispering. Some recognized Camille's name. A few even Googled her on their phones. And in doing so, they discovered the truth. The woman who had just been humiliated at the counter was one of the most senior FAA investigators in the country. That changed everything. By the time Captain Hayes arrived, the pilot of the now grounded flight, Camille had regained complete command of the situation. She addressed him firmly but respectfully. "Captain, this flight is suspended pending investigation. Your crew will be interviewed separately. We'll provide transport for those not under review." The captain, a silver-haired man with 30 years of flying under his belt, nodded solemnly. "Understood, ma'am. I apologize. On behalf of the flight crew, we never meant—" Camille held up a hand. "Thank you, Captain, but we're past apologies. This isn't about courtesy. It's about compliance." He nodded again and stepped aside, knowing better than to argue with someone who had the power to pull his license with a phone call. In the hours that followed, Camille coordinated with her team. She requested surveillance footage from every angle. She drafted a preliminary incident report on the spot. She spoke directly with Director Evans, who authorized a full audit of Ascend Air's Atlanta operations. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, as the sun began to set beyond the terminal windows, Camille took a quiet moment to herself. She stood at the very counter where she had been humiliated, where her identity had been challenged, her document destroyed, her patience tested. She looked at the spot where the passport halves had fallen. That piece of paper had taken her across continents, carried visas from 6 countries, represented everything she had worked for. And in less than 5 seconds, it had been torn apart by someone who saw only what they wanted to see. But from that tear came something bigger, stronger, irreversible. That moment wasn't the end of the operation. It was the beginning of the reckoning. And Camille Turner wasn't just the victim. She was the spark, the storm, the instrument of overdue justice. The tide had turned, and there would be no going back. By sundown, Gate B32 no longer looked like part of a public terminal. It resembled a crime scene frozen in bureaucratic amber. Yellow security tape cordoned off the boarding counter. The departure screen still read, "Ascend Air Flight 782, delayed." But by now, everyone involved knew that flight wasn't going anywhere. The flight was grounded, not by weather, not by mechanical failure, but by the weight of truth. The investigation had officially begun. Within 30 minutes of Dr. Camille Turner's Code Black invocation, the airport's federal liaison team moved in with remarkable efficiency. This wasn't their first emergency, but it was rare to see a breach unfold in real time, with eyewitnesses, camera footage, and a senior FAA inspector as the victim. Most scandals arrived to them after the damage had already been buried beneath paper trails. This one arrived raw, alive, untampered. Camille established her temporary command post in a back office, commandeered from Ascend Air. The room was cluttered with out-of-date training posters and cheap motivational signs that read things like "Fly with Pride" and "People Before Protocol." Irony hung thick in the air. She didn't care about decor. She needed power outlets, secure communications, and a desk large enough for evidence bags. Within the hour, that room became ground zero for one of the most sweeping investigations in recent FAA history. The first order of business, securing the evidence. Agent Davies retrieved the torn passport from the gate. It was placed into a tamper-evident envelope, logged and photographed. The scanner logs from Gate B32 were pulled. Camille had already noted that Brenda hadn't used the ID scanner, confirming a breach of both company policy and federal regulation. Run every minute of security footage from this gate in the last 48 hours, Camille instructed. I want to see how she handles other passengers. Look for patterns, race, age, language barriers, anything. She had barely finished the sentence when her phone buzzed. It was Director Evans. "Turner," he said, skipping pleasantries, "are you absolutely certain about moving forward with a full-scale audit?" "Yes," she replied without hesitation. "It's not just about a torn passport. There's a cultural rot here. This was not an isolated act of bias. It was a symptom of a systemic disease." Evans sighed. "All right, you have full clearance, but be precise, be thorough. We're not just hitting them with citations, we're rewriting their future." Camille hung up and turned to her growing team. More agents had arrived. Data analysts, forensic auditors, even a representative from the Office of Civil Rights. She outlined her scope quickly, her tone like that of a general assembling troops before battle. "I want full employee records on Brenda Kowalski and her direct supervisor, Frank Miller. If she's this bold in public, imagine what she's done off camera. We're not just looking for misconduct, we're looking for the culture that nurtured it." By midnight, the dam broke. Brenda's personnel file was a goldmine of buried red flags. 14 official complaints. At least a dozen more marked as verbal reports that had never made it to HR. Several emails, recovered from her work account, revealed open disdain for certain passengers. One message, sent to Frank, read, "Another one today. Didn't speak a lick of English, but still expected to sit near the front. I lost her seat assignment." "Problem solved," Frank's reply. "LOL, just keep it subtle, B. You've got eyes on you now." The LOL wasn't just a poor attempt at humor. It was the nail in his coffin. "Start matching complaints to emails," Camille ordered. timeline them, build a pattern. If we can prove deliberate obstruction or discrimination, especially under management's watch, we're talking civil rights violations, possibly even criminal conspiracy. The analysts moved fast. Brenda wasn't the only name that surfaced. A baggage supervisor had a suspiciously long record of lost luggage tied to surnames of African or Middle Eastern origin. A ticketing agent had manually moved entire families of color to middle seats, bypassing empty rows. The entire station, it seemed, had been operating like an old machine, rusted, neglected, and dangerous. And now, Camille was prying off the cover and letting the world see the grime beneath. By morning, Camille's desk was covered in evidence packets. Security footage confirmed Brenda had verbally belittled at least 3 passengers in the days prior. Each time she had managed to avoid detection by blaming bad attitudes or communication issues. But none of her victims had destroyed government documents. None of them had pushed back hard enough to tip the scales. Until Camille. As the audit expanded, Ascendair Corporate tried to contain the fire. Their legal department contacted Camille directly, offering apologies, suggesting private resolution. She shut them down instantly. "This isn't a PR problem," she said on the recorded call. "It's a national security breach and a civil rights investigation. If you want mercy, cooperate. If not, prepare to see this play out under congressional scrutiny." The lawyer on the other end said little. Just one long breath. Then a quiet, "Understood." Meanwhile, Brenda sat in an interview room, visibly shaken, her confidence completely gone. Agent Chen questioned her gently, but thoroughly. "You claim you had a feeling. That something about Dr. Turner's passport didn't feel right," she said, arms folded. Brenda nodded weakly. "Yes." The photo looked off. Her attitude. "Her attitude?" Chen repeated. "Please elaborate." Brenda hesitated. She was confident, almost defiant, like she expected special treatment. "She expected you to follow procedure," Chen said flatly. "Instead, you violated federal law." The words sat heavy in the air. "Do you know how to spot a fake passport?" Chen continued. "Have you been trained on UV verification, holographic seals, microtext?" Brenda's eyes flicked downward. I think I've seen some of that in the manual. You've worked this job for over 20 years, and you can't tell me the security features on a U.S. passport." Brenda said nothing. In another room, Frank Miller was being questioned. He was sweating profusely, his tie loosened, his hands trembling. "You signed off on 14 complaints," Camille told him. "Each time, employee counseled." "What did that counseling involve, Mr. Miller?" Frank stammered. I told her to be careful with her language, to be polite." "And when she ignored that, you kept her at the gate?" "She got results," he muttered. "She kept people moving." Camille leaned forward. "She also made discriminatory decisions, obstructed passengers, and today, she tore up a federal passport. This happened on your watch. You didn't manage a problem, you protected it." Frank said nothing, but the guilt on his face said everything. By day 3, Camille's team had discovered the most dangerous failure yet: falsified maintenance records. A flight from Atlanta to Seattle had suffered a cabin pressure issue months prior. The official report blamed a part defect. Camille's audit found the sensor had been reused 3 times beyond its safety limit, and the technician who supposedly signed off on the inspection was on vacation in Florida. That turned the investigation from civil misconduct to criminal endangerment. Camille stood in front of her team, a dry erase board covered in names, dates, and arrows behind her. "This isn't a bad apple problem," she said. "It's a bad barrel. and we're going to empty it." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Everyone in the room already knew. They weren't just building a case against Brenda or Frank. They were exposing a culture where prejudice had been normalized, where convenience had replaced safety, and where silence had been bought with speed and plausible deniability. The reckoning had begun with a single tear, ripping through paper, yes, but also through an entire structure of neglect. And under Camille Turner's command, nothing would be left unexamined. Not a single email, not a single policy, not a single lie. It began with a passport. It ended with a firestorm. By the end of the third day, word of the incident at Gate B32 had spread far beyond the terminals of Hartsfield-Jackson. A cell phone video posted by a young passenger, titled "Gate Agent Rips Up Black Woman's Passport, Then Finds Out Who She Is," had gone viral. Within hours, it was trending on every major social platform. News anchors dissected the footage. Commentators drew parallels to everything from racial profiling to institutional decay. And by morning, it had become the lead story on every major network in the country. The fallout was swift, brutal, and wide-reaching. Brenda Kowalski, the gate agent whose arrogant snap judgment triggered the storm, was fired before her shift would have even ended under normal circumstances. But that was only the beginning. Arrested by airport police within hours, she faced multiple federal charges, including destruction of a government-issued document, civil rights violations, and obstruction of a federal investigation. Her mugshot, taken less than 12 hours after her smug smirk at the gate, showed a hollow-eyed woman, hair disheveled, makeup smudged. Gone was the pride. Gone was the control. She was processed, released on bond, and immediately bombarded by a media storm that parked itself outside her suburban home. Her neighbors refused to speak on camera. Some nodded in sympathy. Others didn't answer their doors. A few days later, Brenda made the mistake of granting an interview to a local station. The anchor asked if she believed race had played a role in how she treated Dr. Camille Turner. Brenda answered, "I've worked with people of all backgrounds. I just had a gut feeling something was wrong." That single line, "a gut feeling," was replayed across every news cycle in America. Civil rights advocates seized on it as proof of unchecked bias masquerading as professional discretion. The U.S. Attorney's Office, now under pressure from both the Department of Justice and the FAA, added formal civil rights charges to Brenda's indictment. But even that wasn't the most damning blow. Frank Miller, the longtime station supervisor who had protected Brenda, minimized complaints, and turned a blind eye for the sake of on-time departures, became the next domino to fall. Fired the same day as Brenda, he faced deeper scrutiny, not just for negligence but for willful misconduct. His downfall came not in front of a camera, but in a small, quiet federal conference room when he agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for reduced sentencing. What he revealed destroyed any last pretense that Ascend Air had suffered from a single rogue employee. He handed over internal emails, admitted to shredding internal reports, confirmed that he had quietly advised problematic staff to keep it subtle and stick to the gray areas. He gave names, he gave timelines, and in doing so, he sealed his own fate. Charged with falsification of safety records and obstruction of a federal audit, Frank faced up to 20 years in prison. His plea deal dropped that to 5, but with it came a lifetime ban from working in aviation. For a man who had once dreamed of running an entire regional hub, it was a complete professional erasure. He died by the same ladder he climbed, one reporter wrote, fast, quiet, and without fanfare. But the real hammer came for Ascend Air itself. Camille Turner, with full support from FAA Director Evans, wrote the preliminary findings report with surgical precision. It was more than just a case file. It was a map of moral decay. The report detailed how one employee's unchecked behavior had been enabled by a supervisor, protected by weak oversight, and ignored by an entire corporate structure that had prioritized efficiency over ethics. It included video stills, emails, complaint histories, falsified maintenance logs, and employee records. The evidence showed clear bias not only in customer service but in maintenance and safety practices. Mechanics signing off on aircraft they hadn't even touched. Parts reused beyond their legal limits. Flights pushed out with barely enough checks to meet minimum standards. When the report was leaked to the press, Ascend's PR team scrambled. They issued a statement of apology, promised retraining, called the incident an isolated failure, but no one was buying it. Stock in Ascend Air plummeted by 28% in a single week. Major consumer advocacy groups launched boycott campaigns. Travel influencers denounced the airline to their millions of followers. Members of Congress called for formal oversight. And then came the fine. The FAA, citing multiple security breaches, violations of federal law, and failure to comply with aviation regulations, levied one of the largest civil penalties in agency history, a $120 million fine, with a full 30% of it earmarked for retraining, oversight, and compliance restructuring. Even worse for the airline, they were now under the control of a court-appointed federal monitor, someone who would oversee every internal document, hiring decision and security report for the next 5 years. And who did they ask to help draft the terms of that oversight? Dr. Camille Turner. It was poetic justice in its purest form. The airline's CEO was forced to issue a national apology, stiff, rehearsed, and clearly crafted by legal advisors. He sat under the glare of TV lights, his face tight, voice trembling, as he stated that what happened to Dr. Turner does not reflect our values. The internet responded swiftly, reposting videos, quotes, and screenshots of complaint forms that told a very different story. But perhaps the most surreal twist belonged to the young woman who filmed it all. 24-year-old college student named Maya Dalton. Initially unknown, her video became the catalyst that transformed a humiliating encounter into a historic investigation. She appeared on talk shows, was interviewed by CNN, and even gave a guest lecture at her university about the power of citizen journalism. Camille reached out to her directly, sending a handwritten letter thanking her for her instinct and bravery. "You didn't just capture a moment," Camille wrote. "You captured proof. You captured justice in motion." But for Camille, the moment wasn't about publicity. It wasn't even about punishment. It was about preventing recurrence. In the weeks that followed, she gave closed-door briefings to the FAA, the DOJ, and even the White House Transportation Task Force. Her message was the same in every room. Bigotry in aviation is not just immoral, it is dangerous. It leads to compromised decisions, mistrust between passengers and personnel, and a weakening of national security. "Every time we ignore a pattern of prejudice," she said in one testimony, "we invite disaster. Not all attacks come from the outside. Some rot from within." That sentiment would eventually be engraved, almost word for word, on the first page of the revised FAA Ethics Manual. And what of Brenda? Her trial was set for the following spring. Legal experts predicted that she would either take a plea deal or face a minimum of 10 years. Her attorney tried to paint her as a scapegoat, a low-level worker who panicked. But the video, the emails, and her own words, "I had a feeling," spoke louder than any defense. Frank Miller, meanwhile, sat quietly in a federal holding facility, awaiting sentencing. Once proud, once powerful, he was now just another name on a docket. His fall was so complete, so absolute, that even former co-workers whispered about him in the past tense. And Camille? She never asked for recognition. She didn't seek headlines. But when she later stood before a congressional committee to deliver her findings, she wore a navy blue suit, crisp and tailored. Her voice was clear, steady, commanding. Behind her, on a large digital display, was a single image, the torn halves of her passport. It had been destroyed in arrogance but preserved in purpose. The committee listened as she outlined every flaw, every crack in the system, and every preventable failure. When she finished, a young black staffer approached her quietly, eyes shining. "Dr. Turner," she said, "thank you for not staying silent." Camille nodded, weary but resolute. "I wasn't silent," she replied, "because silence is what let this happen in the first place." And with that, she walked out into the bright morning sunlight, knowing the worst had happened, but the best had begun. In every scandal that captures the nation's attention, there's a moment when the public turns not just to look, but to judge. That moment came quickly after the FAA's explosive findings were made public, and it did not show mercy. What began as a quiet abuse of power at a boarding gate turned into a full-blown cultural reckoning. Gate B32, once just another checkpoint in a busy airport, was now a household phrase. Whispered on talk shows, debated in town halls, and dissected in courtrooms. The media labeled it the passport incident, but for most Americans it was something more visceral. The story of a black woman who was torn down for daring to exist in a space someone else thought she didn't belong, and who stood up and dismantled an entire system with the truth and law. Dr. Camille Turner never sought fame, but in the weeks that followed, she became the reluctant face of accountability. The moment that changed everything for the public was the release of the gate surveillance footage. Not just the viral cell phone video, but the high-definition, multi-angle footage captured by Ascendair's own security system. The FAA obtained it during the audit, and once it was authenticated and redacted, Director Evans made the decision to release it to the public. The video was broadcast on every major network. It showed Camille's calm demeanor, Brenda's sarcastic tone, and the very moment the passport was torn in two, caught from 3 angles, in full sound and clarity. You could hear the rip. You could see the passengers flinch. You could watch Brenda's face twist with petty triumph, and then harden into confusion as Camille transformed before her eyes. People across the country were stunned. Older viewers, veterans, retirees, grandmothers, many of whom had spent decades watching stories of injustice pass by with no resolution, said they watched the footage with tears in their eyes. One 70-year-old woman in Ohio told her local news, "I've traveled all my life. I've seen how folks like Camille get treated, talked down to, doubted, dismissed, but I never saw someone fight back with such quiet dignity." The cultural response didn't stop at sympathy. Public outrage exploded. Airline unions condemned the incident. Civil rights groups issued formal letters demanding legislative oversight. Editorials poured in, from the Washington Post to small-town newspapers in Iowa. Late-night comedians and morning news anchors alike covered the story, some with scathing satire, others with solemn reverence. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Camille Turner was invited to testify before the Senate Committee on Transportation and Public Safety. She walked into the chamber in Washington, D.C., not in joggers and a sweatshirt, but in a tailored navy suit, her hair pulled back, her posture firm. Behind her, a high-resolution still image from the surveillance video showed the 2 halves of her passport on the counter. A visual symbol of everything the moment represented: disrespect, misjudgment, and then consequences. Senators from both parties listened closely. Camille didn't raise her voice. She didn't posture. She laid out facts, supported by evidence from her team's investigation. "What happened to me at Gate B32, she began, was not an anomaly. It was not one person's bad day. It was the natural outcome of an institutional culture that tolerated bias, overlooked misconduct, and valued speed and profit above ethics and law." She continued, citing the falsified maintenance logs, the patterns of discrimination in customer service, and the deliberate suppression of passenger complaints. She named names, she named systems, and she issued a warning. "When we allow prejudice to dictate who is trusted and who is doubted," she said, "we compromise not only dignity, but national security." The room fell silent. Outside the chamber, Camille was approached by a staffer no older than 23, a young black woman with natural curls and a suit 2 sizes too big. "You're the reason I'm here," the girl said, voice shaking. "Thank you for not staying quiet." Camille placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're the reason I didn't." Meanwhile, Ascendair reeled from the aftershocks. The federal fine was only the beginning. Class action lawsuits were filed by former passengers with documented complaints. At least 3 disability advocacy groups joined forces to challenge the airline's pattern of discrimination. Congressional leaders called for mandatory bias training across the industry. Some even introduced new legislation under the name the Turner Protocol, which would impose stricter consequences for gate-level misconduct and require annual reporting of discrimination incidents. The airline's reputation was in free fall. Their CEO embarked on a disastrous apology tour, appearing on national television to read scripted remorse through clenched teeth. But no apology could undo the footage. No soundbite could erase Brenda's smirk, or Frank Miller's email that read, "Just keep it subtle next time." The public was unmoved. Passengers began canceling tickets. Social media erupted with hashtags like #flyfare and #notwithascend. Major corporate accounts pulled their advertising deals. Airport partners began to quietly renegotiate their contracts, distancing themselves from the brand. Then came the protests. At Atlanta International, New York's LaGuardia, and even Chicago O'Hare, small but vocal demonstrations sprang up, led not by politicians but by regular citizens. Flight attendants, teachers, retirees, college students. People held signs reading, "Dignity is not optional," and "Who gets to fly first?" The pressure mounted. The airline was forced to suspend dozens of employees whose complaint histories had been unearthed by the FAA audit. Internal compliance officers were replaced. Frank Miller, even while awaiting sentencing, was made the example that no one wanted to follow. Meanwhile, Brenda, whose face was now synonymous with modern-day gatekeeping, was quietly indicted under federal civil rights statutes. Her trial date was set. Legal analysts predicted a guilty verdict. In a last-ditch effort to control the narrative, her defense team released a statement saying Brenda had acted under stress, that she felt threatened, and that she did not intend harm. The internet pounced. "She didn't feel threatened when she was smirking," one post read. Another, "Destroying a passport takes intention." She intended plenty, and in the midst of this tidal wave of accountability, Camille remained remarkably quiet. She didn't appear on every show that asked. She declined interviews. She told her team, "The evidence is the message, the facts do the talking." But she didn't disappear. She was invited to speak at aviation security conferences, civil rights symposiums, and universities across the country. Each time, she brought the same message. Justice isn't personal, it's systemic. And if we want to keep our skies safe, we have to protect our values on the ground. One of her most powerful speeches came at Howard University, where she had once studied alone under the flickering library lights, hoping that one day her voice would matter. Now she stood in front of hundreds of students, faculty, and alumni holding up a replica of her torn passport. "This," she said, "is what happens when we allow silence to become policy." She paused. "And this," she added, pointing to the room, "is what happens when we answer with truth." The applause lasted nearly 5 minutes. Across the country, older Americans, those who had lived through the civil rights movement, Vietnam protests, and the post-9/11 fear, found themselves reflecting. This wasn't just another outrage cycle, it was a reminder that accountability can still be real, that dignity, when defended fiercely and lawfully, still matters. Camille Turner never asked to be a symbol, but through calm courage, ruthless professionalism, and unshakable clarity, she became something even more enduring: a reckoning. And as the airline, the courts, and the public slowly processed the storm she had triggered, one truth stood unshaken. When prejudice tries to fly under the radar, someone must rise high enough to bring it down. Camille Turner didn't just rise, she soared. In the aftermath of the scandal that began at Gate B32, something rare and extraordinary happened: real change. Not the kind born of panic or public relations spin, but change rooted in accountability, in truth, in hard-won courage. And at the center of it all stood Dr. Camille Turner, a woman who refused to be reduced to a stereotype, who used the very system that had tried to humiliate her to expose and dismantle something far greater. The consequences were far-reaching. Brenda Kowalski was convicted on multiple federal charges, her defense dismantled by the very procedures she had ignored. Frank Miller, once a loyal company man, was sentenced to prison after admitting under oath that he had covered up misconduct to maintain efficiency. Ascend Air's top executives were replaced, and the airline entered a 5-year period of federal oversight, its very future now tethered to the reforms Camille helped design. But the true outcome wasn't measured in convictions or fines. It was measured in awareness, in conversations, and in the growing understanding that bias isn't just hurtful, it's dangerous. Airlines across the country began reassessing their training programs. Gate agents were retrained, not just on procedures but on empathy. As diversity audits were launched in 3 major carriers. The FAA introduced a new compliance model named after the operation that exposed the rot, the Safe Skies Protocol. And Camille Turner was asked to serve on the National Advisory Board, tasked with shaping the future of aviation security. Not with more machines, but with better people. In her speeches and testimonies, Camille never framed herself as a hero. She spoke of weariness, of fear, of all the moments she wanted to walk away. But what made her stand out wasn't what she endured, it was what she did because of it. "I wasn't trying to change the system," she told a packed auditorium at a leadership forum. "I was just trying to survive it." But survival, when done with clarity and courage, has a way of waking up everything around it. And it did. For every passenger who had ever been treated like they didn't belong, for every mother told to calm down, every disabled veteran dismissed at the counter, every young person stared down for wearing the wrong clothes or speaking with an accent. Camille's stand was a reminder. You don't have to accept injustice quietly. The image of her torn passport, now displayed in a traveling civil rights exhibit, became a symbol of that message. Not just destruction, but transformation. What was meant to reduce her to less than human became the very moment she reclaimed her power. And in a country often fatigued by injustice, her story struck a nerve. Because it reminded people that integrity still matters, that truth, when backed by discipline and law, can still overcome hate, and that sometimes the strongest revolution doesn't come from shouting. It comes from standing still while everyone else tries to make you move. Gate B32 will never just be a gate again. not in FAA records, not in airline training modules, and not in the hearts of those who watched a quiet act of cruelty turn into a national reckoning. The system blinked. Camille Turner did not. And because of that, we all fly safer, see clearer, and stand stronger. What do you think justice should look like when everyday people are wronged by powerful systems? If Camille Turner's courage inspired you, or if her story made you reflect on the power of quiet resistance, let's talk about it. Drop a comment below, give this video a like, and make sure you subscribe to our channel for more real stories that expose truth, inspire change, and remind us all that silence doesn't have to be the end. Tap the bell icon to never miss a story that just might open someone's eyes, including your own.